And it's not clear why Mrs. Trump will need to remain in the hospital for the rest of the week. Meanwhile, the White House still refuses to apologize for that aide's morbid comment mocking John McCain's health. The deputy press secretary repeatedly claimed the problem was dealt with internally without further explanation.
Instead, President Trump is focusing on staff leakers, calling them, quote, traitors and cowards. Kellyanne Conway, his counsel, saying those leakers are only using the media to hurt each other, and claims personnel changes are on the horizon. Overseas, meanwhile, Israel facing international criticism after nearly 60 Palestinians were killed in Gaza protests. The deaths happening the same day the U.S. opened its embassy in Jerusalem. The White House standing by its ally Israel, blaming the terror group Hamas for the tragic violence. Let's start our coverage with CNN's Caitlin Collins. She's live at the White House this morning. Good morning, Caitlin.
Well, good morning, David. This morning, the First Lady remains in the hospital recovering from that kidney illness, and aides have been tight-lipped about the details surrounding her procedure, but they insist that she is recovering without trouble at a military hospital outside of Washington. Now, President Trump remained back at the White House while Melania underwent this procedure yesterday, but he did visit her yesterday evening.
The First Lady underwent a long-planned medical procedure, and I'm pleased to report the procedure was a success, and Melania is already on the mend.
First Lady Melania Trump is recovering after undergoing an embolization procedure at Walter Reed Medical Center to treat what her office describes as a benign kidney condition. The First Lady's communications director offering limited details about the procedure, but noting that Mrs. Trump will likely remain at the hospital until the end of the week.
An embolization procedure, it's not really surgery. It's basically threading this catheter near the kidney and injecting a glue-type substance to try and stop blood flow to an area of the kidney where this abnormality is.
It's the most serious medical procedure a First Lady has undergone while in the White House in over 30 years, since Nancy Reagan had a mastectomy in October of 1987. The procedure coming as the First Lady's popularity continues to grow as she takes on a more prominent role in the White House. Mrs. Trump hosted the administration's first state dinner with the President and First Lady of France last month. And last week, she joined the president in welcoming home 3 Americans who had been detained in North Korea after unveiling her official Be Best platform focused on helping children.
The 3 main pillars of Be Best will include well-being, social media use, and opioid abuse.
President Trump wasn't at the hospital during his wife's procedure, but he visited with her for over an hour last night, tweeting that the procedure was a success and that Mrs. Trump is in good spirits. But before commenting on the First Lady, the president lashing out at his own staff for recent White House leaks, tweeting, "Leakers are traitors and cowards, and we will find out who they are."
It's not so much leaking as using the media to shiv each other.
Do you expect personnel changes as a result?
I do. Actually, yes, I do.
The president's criticism coming as the White House continues to refuse to apologize for White House aide Kelly Sadler's crass remark about Senator John McCain.
Why not just apologize so America doesn't think that that is an acceptable way of speaking inside this White House?
Well, I understand the focus on this issue, but it's going to be dealt with and has been dealt with internally.
Now, David and Allison, the White House has threatened to go after leakers before, but it's actually quite difficult for them to do because so many people in this White House do speak to reporters, including at times President Trump himself. President will be on Capitol Hill today for a lunch with Senate Republicans. Senator John McCain will not be at that lunch, but several of his allies on Capitol Hill who think the White House mishandled the situation over that remark about Senator McCain will be there.
All right, Caitlin, thank you very much for all those points. Joining us now to talk about all of this, we have CNN Chief Medical Correspondent Dr. Sanjay Gupta and CNN White House reporter Kate Bennett, who covers the First Lady. So, Kate, let me just start with you. You have so many great sources. Do you know how the First Lady is doing this morning? And do you have any sense of why she needs to stay in the hospital for what we've been told is a, somewhat benign, well, totally benign and somewhat routine procedure?
No new details out of her office. She was resting comfortably last I heard from sources last night at the hospital. Things were going well after the president left. She was a bit fatigued, as one can imagine, after a day of medical procedure. She's doing well. As to how long she's staying, her office said that it could be the duration of the week. I think that's just out of an abundance of caution, perhaps. Certainly, and Sanjay can address this, things could go wrong. There's infection. There's all sorts of things. The First Lady, as I know her and have been covering her, is very by the book, by the rules. She's very detailed. She's also very private. I would imagine we won't hear that much more about this procedure. I imagine we won't hear any more information about her health until she's released from the hospital. I don't think that's not very out of the ordinary for her. I don't think we should read into it too much. I do think she probably followed her physician's advice. She's pretty used to adhering to the rules. She's very different in a way from her husband in that sense. She's not loosey-goosey on facts and details, and she's a very different kind of person, very calculated. So I imagine that this issue, and it was interesting, the vice president said in that clip that this was a long-planned procedure. That was certainly news to us. The news that she was going in was a surprise. So she may have been experiencing some pain. She may have been sort of fighting through some stuff. As we saw her publicly last week, we just don't know the severity of what she was feeling and therefore what her recovery process might be like. But again, it's very, very classic, very typical of her small and loyal team. Speaking of leaks just there that Caitlin was speaking about, the West Wing, the East Wing is a completely different operation. She has 10 people on her staff. I know because it makes it a little more challenging sometimes to cover her. This is a very tight-knit, close-lipped group. You think about it, the First Lady had a full procedure in the hospital yesterday. No one knew about it until after it was over.
So, Sanjay, can you walk us through the medical piece of this, which is what do we know about it? What might the circumstances tell us about what it is and what the prognosis is?
Well, what we know is just a short statement basically saying that the First Lady underwent a embolization procedure for a benign kidney condition. And what an embolization procedure is basically, it's a procedure, even more than an operation. You're putting basically a large IV in a blood vessel that's just about top of the leg. You're threading a catheter up there, as you can see, into the area where this abnormality is. And then you're injecting the substance that is almost a glue-like substance to try and block off those arteries. You're trying to basically cut off the blood flow to that abnormality, hoping that abnormality then, because it lost its blood flow, can no longer grow and eventually withers away. If that abnormality was at risk of bleeding, you can greatly decrease the risk as well. So that's and it was done for a benign condition. Typically, when you hear something like that, you think it's done for a cancer, a type of cancerous tumor, but they're very clear in the statement, a benign kidney condition. What they don't tell us, though, is what it is. Is this a benign sort of mass? Is it something else? Is it an abnormality in the blood vessels around the kidney? We just don't know yet, and we also don't know whether maybe she's having more procedures. No one has said that, but being in the hospital for several days still, it's curious. It's certainly a lot longer than you'd expect.
But these kinds of conditions, a benign condition, does it say anything about future kidney function?
Well, it's something like this. If you have a procedure like the embolization, you still sounds like she still has a functioning kidney, and she obviously has another kidney as well. So kidney function really shouldn't be a problem for her.
Kate, do you have any reporting on why the president wasn't with her for the procedure?
I would imagine, and from what my sources have told me, this was probably a decision that was made by the First Lady not to have him there. She, as I said, she is very private, below the radar. If the president were to be there, he would have to bring more security, a large motorcade, and the press pool, and that could have alerted or tipped people off in a different way to expose what was happening yesterday at Walter Reed before she was felt comfortable announcing it when she was out of the procedure. He did call her right beforehand to check in before she went in for the procedure. He spoke with her physician, her main doctor, right after on the telephone to make sure everything went okay, which it sounds, according to the statement, as though it was a successful procedure. And then later he did go visit her. He spent about an hour with her in the hospital. He met again with her medical team, with the nurses there, thanked them in person, and stayed with the First Lady, from my understanding, until she probably wanted to get some rest, and he headed back to the White House. So he's definitely been engaged. I think, again, this is a decision that was not necessarily the president's decision, and this was a request that was likely made by the First Lady. You stay there. I'm going to do this. Let's, keep it under the radar. Don't tweet about it, and we'll get through it.
Yeah. Sanjay, can you just explain why do you think it's, as Kate said, it's an abundance of caution? Why she would be staying there many extra days?
This is the biggest open question mark, I think, Allison. I don't know. This type of procedure, just a embolization type procedure. I mean, patients can go home as the same day. They can do this as an outpatient, come in the morning, leave the same day. Sometimes out of caution because there's a concern. Look, is someone going to develop pain when you start to block up those blood vessels? Sometimes it can cause pain. There's a concern about infection, as Kate mentioned. There's a concern about bleeding itself just from the procedure. But even with those things, staying overnight is more typical. To say that you're going to stay till the end of the week, if that's the case, if in fact she is staying till the end of the week, I just wonder that there seems to be a little bit of an open question mark. Is there something more to come still? Is there something that we still don't know exactly about what happened here?
Yeah. Okay, Sanjay Gupta, Kate Bennett, thank you very much. Keep us on speed dial should there be any developments. Thank you both very much. All right, now to this news. Violent protests expected to flare up again in Palestinian territories following the deadliest day in Gaza in 4 years. Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas now calling for 3 days of mourning as Israel and the White House blame Hamas for Monday's bloodshed. CNN's Ian Lee is live in Gaza for us. What is the situation at this hour, Ian?
Listen, we're monitoring this camp right here. This is one of many along the Gaza border. You can see behind me, they're already starting to burn tires. We're not seeing the numbers that we saw yesterday, but we're not expecting the people really to come out until after the funerals that take place today, so in about an hour, 2 hours time. But people are starting to come in. Dozens of people here now, not the thousands, the tens of thousands we saw, but Israel has already responded with a bit of tear gas to disperse everyone. We've also seen some tank movements along the border. There's been, yesterday we heard tanks firing into Gaza, the army saying they were targeting Hamas positions, also airstrikes yesterday. And it was easy to see why yesterday was the deadliest day since that 2014 war, with 60 people killed, including 8 children. A lot of those people who were killed, though, were going right towards that border fence behind me. For its part, Israel says that is their red line. They're not going to let anyone cross it, and they'll disperse people first with tear gas and then live ammunition if they get closer. The international community, though, has come out and condemned Israel for what they say is excessive force. This is the UN. This is Doctors Without Borders. But for its part, Israel says that it is Hamas that is sending people over there close to that border and putting their lives at danger. But today we will be monitoring this spot and spots all along this border to see if we get a repeat of that violence. David?
Ian Lee, thank you so much. Who was monitoring that story in Israel. Meantime, back at the White House, it's clear that no one there is going to apologize. Still deflecting questions on those offensive comments a staffer made about Senator John McCain. So the questions are still coming. The controversy is still here. So it's an old story now. The White House still not apologizing for those morbid comments made by aide Kelly Sadler. Instead, the president is targeting those leaking information from the West Wing, tweeting this. The so-called leaks coming out of the White House are a massive over-exaggeration. He goes on to say leakers are traitors and cowards, and we will find out who they are. Let's discuss with CNN political analysts John Avlon and Alex Burns. First of all, there's a lot of leakers, including the president.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting reaction. Did we have any insight into why he's going after them over this?
Well, I think the president's natural instinct is to divide everything into us against them, including his own administration, including leaking, which is something he does a lot of. Look, the federal government is a leaky leviathan. That is the truth. That has always been the truth. But rarely have we had a president do so much leaking, and that creates a tone coming from the top situation. Right. So if he's furious and calling them traitors and cowards, but
it's also Kellyanne Conway who talks about how pernicious the leaking is. This is how she described it.
Some leaks exist to hurt, I guess, colleagues. Some leaks exist because they disagree with the policies that are being put forth. But none of them are helpful. And I will tell you, there's something else that's going on in this White House, but not as badly as it was at the beginning, where it's not so much leaking as using the media to shiv each other. And that was going on quite a bit at the beginning of this administration, and it's less so now.
Do you expect personnel changes as a result?
I do. Actually, yes, I do.
What I love is the countenance, the smile, and the sense of we all hate each other.
No. I like she's smiling with her eyes. That's a sincere smile in that. Yeah, she's really.
But Alex, I'm confused by that explanation, because what does that tell you about the way the White House is run, that they're all shivving each other? I mean,
No, it's the kind of thing that you usually hear from folks on the Hill or folks in the Republican coalition on the outside who are saying, what is wrong with these people? They're constantly shivving each other, right? So to see a White House aide not saying on background, we have this problem that people are constantly shivving each other, but saying on television, attaching her name and face and voice to it, that's really unusual. And it is a gigantic admission of a problem that is kind of framed as a moral stance, right? And this is what the president and his senior aides often do when they are sort of cornered on something that they don't want to apologize for, or don't want to admit any wrongdoing, is they problematize something else that's sort of related to the process around it. Like, let's not talk about the comment, let's talk about the leaking of the comment, even though that in itself is a really
But can we extrapolate from this that there are two camps, at least, inside the White House, one of which, the leakers, think that there are things that they're not comfortable with happening, and they're trying to make those public.
Right. I do think it's fair to say a lot of the leaking from this White House is whistleblowing, particularly from the administration writ large, people being really concerned about departures from norms. And that's different than simply sniping and gossip. I will say that, the shiv being primarily known as a prison weapon seems sort of poetic and upon itself in this country.
I'm not sure that there are two camps of people who leak and people who don't leak, right? This is an administration that leaks every which way, right? And sometimes the people who are most theatrically condemning leaks are people who are themselves under suspicion for leaking. And there's a reason why they're out there saying this.
And let's look at some of the past leaks that they've had to deal with that have been problematic. Aides warning the president against congratulating Vladimir Putin when he was quote unquote reelected. And telephone calls, transcripts with world leaders have gotten leaked. This Rob Porter situation, the abuse allegations when Kelly was aware of them. Rex Tillerson not speaking well of the president. Jared Kushner losing his top circuit clearance. And they go on and on. The president referring to countries in a pejorative fashion. But I do think first of all, to be serious about this, as a reporter, you cover any White House, and the White House is a large operation with a big PR spin operation, and you're trying to get underneath that and trying to find out what's really going on. In this case, if you have people who are at cross purposes, who disagree with each other, it's amplified or magnified by the fact that you really do have a president who is off on his own, and you have this scaffolding of staff and advisors who are trying to pursue certain policies, and they use leaking to try to force a different result.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's not only, look, there's an aspect of leaking which is always pursuing an agenda, but it's usually not in the absence of a president who has a firm grasp on his agenda. And the fact that there's a bit of a vacuum from a policy standpoint, from an ideological standpoint at the top, I think compounds all of that. And there's also the fact that, Trump's own instincts. Going back to John Barron, the days in New York real estate when he posed as his own PR agent, it really does tone does come from the top, and this is something the president has set. And so folks can say, I learned it from you, Dad.
But it's also, there's this agenda piece. It's gossipy, right? And the gossipy stuff really does come from the president. When you've seen, personnel changes, or he's thinking about firing so-and-so, that is coming from him, or, at least indirectly.
Yeah,
indirectly
so saying it's somehow countenanced.
Because he's talking about it in very open ways, or having people do it.
And even if it's not sort of an authorized leak from the president, or the president himself calling up a reporter, he calls up people around town, he calls up friends in Florida, he calls up friends in New York and says, hey, what do you think if I fire this person? Or isn't it time that I replace, General Kelly or something like that, right? So he is stirring this stuff up. He probably doesn't perceive that as him leaking.
Right.
But then when he sees it in the newspaper, he may think, who did that to me?
Right. By the way, journalists, this is what we love. There's nothing. I covered the Bush White House, was very disciplined, and it was very difficult to get, underneath that veil, which is frustrating as a reporter. So that's why reporters are, all smiles.
Let's talk about your reporting about Vice President Mike Pence and what he's up to. Is he is it your reporting that he is attempting to build a coalition of some sort away from the president?
Certainly to tend to sort of his existing power base using the resources of the presidency. And it's actually a sort of a perfect piece to pair with the conversation we were just having, that when you have this kind of chaos in the White House, and when you have this vacuum of political leadership for the Republican Party, the vice president and the vice president's staff have really filled the vacuum, and they are using the prestige of the White House, the resources of the White House to sort of do favors for people who are Mike Pence's friends from Congress, and to steer the president away from some of his own instincts about which candidates to back for Speaker of the House, for governor of important states, in important Senate races. We didn't see this with Joe Biden. We didn't see this with Dick Cheney.
This is almost like the vice president functioning as a parliamentary leader. I mean, he's really sort of marshaling the troops on the congressional fields, people he has direct knowledge of. He is playing some favorites, as Alex points out, but he really is sort of doing the things that a president might typically do, but this one isn't interested in doing. Leading the party, really paying attention to the midterm elections, paying attention to primaries. And in the background and all that is, you know, is he a leader in waiting, whether it's 2024 or someplace else? And
and is the president happy about this, or upset that Mike Pence is going rogue, if that's how to describe it?
You know, by and large, the president and the vice president have a good personal relationship. It's more at the staff level right now, although there was this episode a couple weeks ago where the vice president tried to bring on as an advisor to his office Republican pollster John Lerner, who had been a big Never Trump strategist in 2016, and that definitely got the president's attention, and he certainly wasn't happy about it, and he's smacked that down pretty fast.
The difference is that normally you would have in the West Wing staff of the president's staff someone who controls the political operation, and that's just not the case.
Nominally, you do have those people, right? But they are, as we mentioned at the top, constantly shivving each other.
And you've worked it full circle. Well done. We do have some breaking news for you. Uber announcing big changes to some of its policies in the wake of a CNN investigation that found more than 100 Uber drivers accused of sexual assault or abuse in the past 4 years. CNN's Drew Griffin broke the exclusive reporting. He joins us live with the update. So, Drew, tell us what you've learned.
Well, we've learned that Uber will no longer try to hide the problem and will allow victims to speak out, Allison, as a warning to others. Uber calls this turning the lights on, pledging to transparency, integrity, and accountability. One of the problems we expose for many victims of sexual assault, when you download that Uber app, in the fine print, you're agreeing to arbitration for any legal claims you may have against the company, basically forfeiting your right to sue. That is about to change. It was an issue for one woman we told you about who took Uber after a night out thinking that she had a safe ride home. Instead, she says her Uber driver raped her.
You're in the back seat?
Yep.
You were, I assume, passed out?
Yeah, he woke me up. He had to. He was already penetrating me, and then I remember him performing oral sex, and then after that I don't really remember.
Were you able to fight back? Tell him no?
I was too inebriated.
Her driver, a 47-year-old man, was found carrying her cell phone at a car wash and arrested. He had been charged with a prior sexual crime, but never convicted, which allowed him to pass Uber's background check. Charges against him in this case eventually dismissed. The Uber driver insisted the sex in the back seat of his car was consensual. She is now suing Uber. Allison, like many of these cases in which the victim is intoxicated, the criminal charges against the Uber driver were dropped. She is suing Uber, as we've said. Uber tried to keep her out of the courts, out of the public, by trying to force arbitration and non-disclosure agreements. Uber announcing it's abandoning that legal strategy. Uber's chief legal officer, Tony West, who congratulated CNN on reporting, just announced in this blog post that the company is overhauling the way they can handle sexual assault cases. The company is going to no longer require the arbitration of individuals' claims in sexual assault or harassment. Uber will no longer force victims of sexual harassment or assault to sign these non-disclosure forms. And Uber says it will not silence victims anymore. They can speak out. Finally, Uber says it will commit to publishing a safety transparency report that will include data on sexual assaults and other incidents. That is one thing we've sought from Uber in our reporting and were refused. Now the company says it's going to release internal data on reported sexual assaults. All of these changes coming after our reporting, and months, I should say, after we began asking Uber about all this. and exposing the vulnerability of women riding alone in the backseat of a stranger's car.
Drew, I mean, listen, that's huge, okay? All of those developments on the arbitration and just shining sunlight on all of this, I mean, because of your reporting, huge. But can you just answer, how did this happen in the first place? Were they not doing rigorous enough background checks on all of these people?
Regulators across the country would say no. Uber would say, yes, we do background checks, but it's complicated and part of our continuing story and our continuing investigation. It is not as vigorous a background check as you would get for a taxi or a limo driver. Why? Uber says they're trying to make this more accessible. But a lot of regulators across the state are calling for fingerprint background checking, which Uber does not do. Uber has announced this morning they are going to rerun background checks on its drivers who've been driving a year or more. But still, you're not getting the level of detail in background checks. Not that background checks are going to solve all of this. Awareness, I think, is going to solve a lot of this. People cannot believe that Uber is just ex post facto the safe ride home. But Uber, according to state regulators, according to federal officials we've talked to, can do a better job of background checking its individual drivers.
Drew, thank you for bringing all of this to us and for all of that investigative reporting. Really important. I mean, David, when people think that when you get into an Uber car, you're safe and they've done all the vetting necessary. Now we know there are big holes in that.
There are big holes, and it's the kind of thing, you know, especially you think about more and more parents relying on Uber for their kids. This is the kind of steps that the company has to take.
Yes.
We're going to turn overseas when we come back. Dozens killed in these Gaza clashes. Fears of another day of protests will bring more deaths. What does it all mean for the prospect of any durable peace between Israelis and Palestinians? More than 50 Palestinians are killed in the deadliest day of clashes between Israelis and Palestinians since 2014. The violence in Gaza is creating this split screen with the celebration that has happened just miles away in Jerusalem as the U.S. Embassy officially has been relocated there. The White House placed the blame for the violence squarely on the terror group Hamas.
The responsibility for these tragic deaths rests squarely with Hamas. Hamas is intentionally and cynically provoking this response. And as the Secretary of State said, Israel has the right to defend itself.
Joining me now is former Senator George Mitchell, who served in so many capacities, including special envoy to the Middle East from 2009 to 2011. He's written about the conflict. He's been immersed in the conflict. Senator Mitchell, always good to see you.
Thanks, David. Good to be here.
So I find myself increasingly concerned, frankly, with media coverage of this story because it is so easy, and Hamas as a terror group and the Palestinians exploit this, where there's far less coverage of the knife attacks against Israelis crossing the border or of shelling of Israeli towns. But when there's a big border demonstration like this trying to breach the wall, that gets a lot of attention. And of course, there's just horrible violence and horrible deaths of Palestinians. So given your experience, how do you assess the violence that we've seen? If you were immersed in any kind of peace process, how do you assess how both sides have the responsibility both bear at this point?
Well, Hamas certainly bears a lot of the responsibility. They have a long record of using civilians for military purposes. In the prior conflicts with Israel, they placed rockets and missiles in or close to schools and hospitals to protect them, and urging thousands of unarmed civilians to try to breach the border obviously created a circumstance in which there would be large numbers of casualties. So that's one factor. Israel has a right to defend itself, of course. But it is in Israel's interest, I believe, to exercise as much restraint as possible in the circumstances, since it possesses an overwhelming military advantage. Nobody doubts that.
Right. And they use, you know, if you follow the coverage, they use drones to shoot tear gas to disperse the crowd. When that doesn't happen, they use live ammunition.
Yeah.
I don't know why that's done. I mean, they have rules of engagement that they say were adhered to. That's never going to be a good result.
Well, I think it should be stated, it's in Israel's self-interest to exercise restraint for the following two reasons. First off, the press coverage around the world is largely very negative toward Israel as a result of the lopsided nature of the injuries and deaths in the conflict. But secondly, we talk of the Palestinians, but there are really three distinct groups. Those who are within Israel, those who are in Gaza, which is far distant, it's 100 miles, but it's desert and easy to contain. And one of the problems is, of course, that the Gazans have been contained by both Israel and Egypt. And then the third group in the West Bank, which is the largest group run by the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority has a very active national police force which aggressively suppresses Hamas and any efforts to harm Israel. Israeli military and defense officials repeatedly praised the cooperation with the Palestinian Authority, which ironically continues to this day. Were what is happening in Gaza to spread to Palestinians in the West Bank, Israel would face a much more dangerous and difficult circumstance with a much larger group who are well armed and close to the heart of Israel. And one of the problems President Abbas has is that he is increasingly seen by the Palestinian people as an enforcer of the Israeli occupation as opposed to a leader seeking independence. So it's very much in Israel's interest to show as much restraint as possible to prevent this from spreading to all of the Palestinians.
Right, which creates a bigger threat. And you have Hamas saying that this march of return is the beginning of the end of the existence of Israel, which when your enemy says he wants to destroy you, Israelis tend to take very seriously. Let's get to the question
but just keep in mind, that's Hamas's position. That's not the position of the Palestinian Authority, which recognizes Israel, opposes the use of violence against Israel, and has agreed to abide by all previous treaties.
So let's talk about the embassy move, because all of the arguments against this, the idea that symbolically it's provocative, that it's kind of a dead letter, for moving a peace process. There is a counter argument, which is previous administrations have promised it. They've just they've declined to actually do it. And, maybe it's not going to take Jerusalem off the table because that's always going to be a final status negotiation. But maybe it pushes everybody involved to say, if you want to get serious, take it up on your own. The United States is not going to midwife this thing again because that hasn't worked. Why, Chuck Schumer, as the Democratic leader, has supported it. Why do we necessarily believe that this is a non-starter for any kind of peace process from this administration?
Including the Arabs in the Middle East. The only question is whether there will ever be a Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem of a Palestinian state living side by side, non-militarized, in peace with Israel. And this has cast doubt on that. You just said Jerusalem's not off the table, but President Trump said Jerusalem is off the table. He said exactly the opposite of what you said when it was moved. And so that's what resonated throughout the Middle East with the Palestinians in the Arab world. Israel is the capital. Israel's capital is Jerusalem, and it's off the table in the negotiations. I believe a lot of this could be mitigated if the president said Jerusalem is not off the table and will be the subject of negotiation between the parties as soon as we can get there.
And it's got to be in any negotiation, but he's not saying that at the moment, which is the point.
Well, no, it's not that he's not saying it. He said just the opposite.
I know, I understand. He's saying the opposite. He's not acknowledging
the point.
it.
And so what we have to do is to try to re-engage. I respectfully don't share your view that because America's involvement hasn't produced a result so far that we should withdraw. I think it's just the opposite.
That we always have to
We have to do it because there's no other entity that can.
Yeah. George Mitchell, always good to see you. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
David.
Appreciate it. Allison?
Okay, David. A landmark Supreme Court decision could change the way we see sports in America. Details in the Bleacher Report next.
Lindsay, it's great to see you. As my friend Coach Fitz at Episcopal High School in Alexandria said, a lot of one-on-one ball, not necessarily great team play, but wow, that was some great action.
And you know what? The Warriors are the team that I think can maximize team play, but you knew, David, that this one was going to be good, right? You've got Houston with the best record of any team in the regular season. Golden State, winner of 2 of the last 3 NBA titles, but last night, the difference, a 7-footer named Kevin Durant. Both teams came out swinging, literally. Look at this. The Warriors, Draymond Green and James Harden mixing it up early. Green with the technical foul, barely a minute into the series opener. Houston grabbed a quick lead. They went up by 9. But as Warriors coach Steve Kerr says, Golden State's one luxury is Kevin Durant, who made things miserable for the Rockets, putting up 37 points as his Warriors win on the road 119-106. Those who like to gamble on sports got a big win yesterday. Betting on sports getting the green light from the Supreme Court. Justices struck down a federal law yesterday that kept states from allowing gambling on the outcome of sporting events. Since 1992, it's only been allowed in Nevada due to a loophole. The American Gaming Association estimates at least $150 billion a year is gambled on sports, with 97% of that bet illegally. So the major sports